Hello, everyone, and welcome to lecture 15. If you remember in the last lecture, we focused on individual behavior and how people make environmental decisions. Today, we move one step further and ask another important question, that how do societies manage resources on which everyone depends? Like think about forest, rivers, fisheries, grazing land, groundwater, or even the atmosphere. These are the resources that are shared by many people, right? So if everyone uses them without limits, they can become depleted. But does this always happen? So in this lecture, we will begin with Hardin's famous idea of tragedy of commons, something I think we did discuss in one of the lectures, but today we will deal with this in more detail. And we will also look at Eleanor Ostrom's work, which showed that communities around the world have successfully managed shared resources for generations. Now, by the end of this lecture, what the aim is to explain to you what is the meaning of an institution, rules, cooperation, and it is not just technology that is required for achieving environmental sustainability. Okay, let us first understand what are institutions. Before we discuss even how societies manage shared resources, we need to first understand institutions. So when you hear the word institution, we often think that of a university, a bank, or a government office, right? But in economics, institutions are not organizations or buildings. They are the rules that guide how people behave. So economists like Douglas North call them the rules of the game because they shape how individuals and organizations interact with each other. So institution is not just a building. Okay, it is much more than that. It is actually all the guiding rules that tells us how we need to uh, behave basically. So let us try to understand this in a more detailed way. So it can be divided into three types. The first is formal rules. These are written rules created by governments or legal authorities, example, property rights, fishing quota, forest law, water allocation rules, etc. Then there is also interesting thing, something called informal norms. Now, these are unwritten rules that people follow because of tradition, culture, social expectation. For example, a community may have a tradition of not cutting trees during the breeding season or sharing irrigation water fairly among farmers, not to fish or not to go for fishing at the time when the fish are breeding. These are social norms, and these rules are not written in law, but people follow them because they are accepted by the community. And third one is the enforcement mechanism. So rules are useful only if people follow them. This means that someone must monitor whether the rules are being followed and actions are being taken. If they are broken, you need to make sure that some kind of penalty or some kind of action is taken. So for example, a village community may inspect a community forest and warn or fine people who is cutting trees illegally. So now the question is, why are institutions important for us for ecological economics? The answer is that good institutions lead to better management of natural resources. It is not only who owns a resource, it is also a matter of that there are clear rules, whether people accept those rules or whether they are properly enforced. All of this also matters in the case of a better management of natural resources. So it's not just about owning it, right? It is also about whether good rules are there, whether these rules are followed, people are following these rules, and whether they are properly enforced or not. So for example, a community forest with strong local rules and active monitoring may be better protected than a government-owned forest where rules are rarely enforced. So the key message is that effective environmental governance depends on good institutions, clear rules, community support, and proper enforcement. All of these has to work together. So it's not just having good rules. Please do remember that it also has to be enforced and people have to support those rules. Now, let's talk about a very interesting, article which was written by Garrett Hardin in, 1968, which is very famous, and even now we use it and we call this as the tragedy of the commons. What did he argue? He argued that when a resource is shared by everyone, people will tend to overuse it because each person acts in its on its self-interest. Okay, so let's try to understand this with a simple example. Imagine a village pasture where every farmer can graze their cattle. So a village forest, grazing land where anybody can send their cattle for grazing. There is nobody can stop me sending my cattle, nor anybody can stop you. Suppose one farmer decides to add one more cow, and the farmer gets the full benefits because they can sell more milk or even earn more income, because now from one it has two cows and both the cows get access to that grazing land where the cow can graze. However, the extra grazing damages the pasture. Right? This cost is shared by all farmers, not just the one who has added the cow, because too much of the pasture has been taken, and so it is not getting enough time to regenerate, and because of which everybody is suffering, not just the one who actually had added one more cow. Now, since each farmers think this way, everybody keeps adding more cattle. Because I'm not the only one who would pay. In fact, I benefit more if I buy more cattle and if I can give them to go and graze that land or eat pasture from that land. I am the one who is gaining because I can now sell more milk. And everyone in that village starts doing that without thinking that at the end of the day, everybody is going to suffer, because eventually the pasture becomes overgrazed and cannot support any more animal, and as a result, everyone actually loses. And this is what Hardin called as the tragedy of the commons, when actions are beneficial for individuals end up harming the whole community. Now, this became very famous by basically bringing out the fact that each farmer was actually working on his or her self-interest without trying to do anything to actually protect that land where the cattle were sent out for grazing. Now, Hardin's solution to this problem was two possible solutions that he offered. First is privatization, that shared pasture could be divided into private plots. Each owner would then take better care of their own land because they would bear the full cost of overusing it. Right? So it's like giving property right. You divide it, small plots. This is yours, this is mine. Then the farmer would know that if I send more than three, my land is going to deteriorate and there will be no, food available for my cattle, so I'm not going to spoil the pasture. So they will invest also probably. Second, government regulation. The government could introduce rules such as limiting the number of cattle each farmer can graze and enforcing those rules. But both of these approaches have limitations. Privatization may not be possible for resources such as atmosphere, oceans, or large rivers like Ganges, Brahmaputra, etc. How do you allocate plots to different stakeholders? So it's not possible, which cannot easily be also divided into private ownership. It can also disadvantage poorer people who depend on these resources. So government regulation can also face challenges because government may not always understand local conditions, and enforcing rule, dividing or keeping and monitoring who is using how much water, whom is polluting the river, big rivers like the Ganges, the Yamuna, the Brahmaputra, and all of these can be highly expensive and difficult. So the limitation of Hardin's argument was that although Hardin's idea was very influential, it is based on two important assumptions. Okay, first, he assumes that resources has no rule and anybody can use it freely. So the first point was that land was available and the pasture land was available and anybody can send. There was, as if there was no informal conversations among the farmers, as if the farmers do not know each other, as if the farmers don't make any rules among themselves. Anybody can use it freely. That was his first, problem. And second, he assumed, like I mentioned, people cannot communicate or cooperate with one another. In reality, many communities do communicate, make their own rules, work together to protect such shared resources. And why so? Because on these resources, their livelihood depends. When you say tragedy of the commons, just imagine the entire village community will suffer. Would they really let that happen? That's the question. Will they not foresee what is coming? Because they know that if this continues, they are also going to lose out. So instead of adding one and additional cattle, will they not come together and decide how many they can actually have? And this is exactly what Eleanor Ostrom demonstrated through her research, which we will discuss in the next slide. But the important point to remember is that open access is not the same as common property. A common property resource can have clear users and agreed rules, whereas an open access resource has no rules or restrictions. So do remember this difference. This grazing land or this pasture land was not an open access resource that anybody is coming and going. This belonged to a particular village. Within the periphery of that village, it was more like a common property resource where people were benefiting by sending their cows for grazing. Now, what was Ostrom's critique? That is called Governing the Commons. It's a very interesting article. You must read this. So what she basically, and just to let you know, Eleanor Ostrom also won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 when she studied the communities around the world that had successfully managed scarce resources for hundreds of years. And she looked at forests, grazing lands, irrigation systems, fisheries, and not just in one country, in different countries for hundreds of years, how they are managing these resources. Her research actually showed that tragedy of commons is not inevitable. Communities can successfully manage shared resources if they have good rules, trust each other, and work together. So that's where the institution comes in, if you have strong formal and informal institutions as well. Now, from her research, Ostrom identified 8 design principles, and they are commonly found in successful community managed resources. So when she was traveling around and trying to find out these cases, she found these 8 principles, which is where she saw that these resources, common pool resources, have been managed very, very successfully. The first principle is clearly defined boundaries. Everyone should know who is allowed to use the resource and who is not. For example, a village forest may only be used by people living in that village because it's not open access. Only they would allow those who lives in that village. Then rules fit local conditions. The rules should match the local environment and needs of the community. For example, a village in a dry area may have different water use rules than a village where water is abundant. So you must have locally contextual rules. You cannot have something which is absolutely not grounded in the real situation of that particular area. People participation in making rules. People who use resource should also help making those rules. When people are involved in decision making, they are more likely to follow the rules. It's very important takeaway actually, that you involve people, then they will also follow because they were a part of that decision making. They know the context and the background, why that rule has been made. Monitoring, someone should regularly check whether people are following the rules. For example, members of the community may take turns to monitor a forest or irrigation canal. Fair penalties. If someone breaks the rule, punishment should be fair. For a first mistake, there may be a warning. If person keeps breaking the rules again, the penalty can become much more serious. There should be easy ways to resolve conflicts. Disagreements are natural, so communities should have simple and low-cost ways to solve problems. Disputes can be discussed in village meeting, for example, instead of going to courts. Seventh, communities should have the right to organize. Government should allow communities to create and manage their own rules instead of replacing them unnecessarily. That's very important. There are customized social norms related, culturally connected rules. And rather than coming up with rules which are absolutely not context specific, it is better to allow communities to create and manage their own rules. Cooperation at different levels. Some resources such as rivers or forests are too large for one community to manage alone. So in such cases, local communities, government and other organizations should work together, which is something we call it as a polycentric government, which we will discuss in the next slide. Now, what was the key message? Ostrom's 8 principles are not strict rules that must follow in every situation. Instead, they are lessons learned from successful communities around the world. Her work showed that shared resources can be managed sustainability when there are clear rules, community participation, monitoring, and trust. This particularly Ostrom's, 8 principles actually challenged Hardin's view that tragedy of commons is unavoidable. Now, one of the important things that we need to discuss, and today we see a lot of environmental issues coming up, is also because of this whole issue of property right. Who owns the resource and who has the right to use it? So, this is something that we'll discuss first is that there are four main, so different types of property rights, first of all, can lead to different environmental outcomes. However, there is no single system that is always the best. Always remember, it depends on in what context are we talking about the property right. And the success of any system depends on the resource itself. What is that resource whose property right we are talking about, and how well it is managed. So there are four main property rights regimes. So first I told you open access. In an open access system, no one owns the resource and anyone can use it. For example, before international agreements, anyone could fish in parts of the open ocean. Since there are no clear rules, people often caught as many fish as possible, and many a times leading to overfishing. And this is definitely a situation that Hardin described, the tragedy of commerce, because it's an open access system. Then comes private property. In a private property system, the resource belongs to an individual or a company. A farmer owns a piece of agricultural land, since the farmer benefits from that land. Keeping the land productive, usually, or taking good care of it itself is an incentive to the farmer, because then they can actually gain more. So however, private ownership does not work for resources such as atmosphere or the ocean, like I already mentioned, because this cannot be divided into private pieces, something that Hardin basically mentioned, but it's not possible to actually, for certain resources, you cannot really have private property. And remember, tragedy of the common or Ostrim's governing the commons were not for a specific common property. This was mainly for several other resources, which also includes forest, ocean, atmosphere, etc. Common property. In a common property system, a resource is shared by specific groups of people who follow rules, agreed rules. Now remember, there's a difference between open access and common property. So a village may jointly manage a grazing land or a community forest. Only members of the community can use it, and everyone agrees to follow certain rules. But this is very different from open access, because there are clear users and clear rules. Now, Ostrom's research showed that common property systems can work very well when communities cooperate. So her focus was mostly on these commons, not on those open access. Then there is something like state property, of course, like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, reserve forests, which are owned by government, managed by them. If the government has good rules, strong enforcement, these resources can be well protected. For example, Kaziranga National Park is a state property, but if management is weak, the system may not perform well. Now, what is the key message from here? The key message is that no single property right system is always the best. A private forest, a community forest, or a government forest can all be managed successfully or poorly, depending upon what is the kind of institution we have, what kind of rules we have, how effective is the enforcement, and what is the level of cooperation among the users, right? So now this is where let us also, like I mentioned, in many cases, only one level of governance may not work. You may need polycentric governance. So let's try and understand what is this meaning of a polycentric governance. So polycentric governance basically means that different levels of government and different organizations work together to manage natural resources. Instead of one authority making all decisions, responsibility is shared. So the idea is simple, that the level of governance should match the scale of environmental problem. So what are these different levels? For example, local level. Some resources are best managed by local communities because they know the area well. For example, a village committee can effectively manage a community forest, a local irrigation system, a village pond, for example. Then something comes the regional level. Some resources extend beyond one village or district and require cooperation between different communities. For example, a river basin flows through many districts or even states. Assam and Arunachal has the Brahmaputra flowing. Managing water in one village in alone is not enough, so different areas need to work together. So that's the regional level governance. Then comes national level. Some environmental issues also requires national government to come in. For example, government makes environmental laws, create national parks, regulate pollution, develop climate policies for whole country. And then global level, some environmental problems affect the entire world, cannot be solved by one country alone. Climate change, ocean pollution, biodiversity loss, transboundary water issues, all of these requires many countries to come together and work. And so you also come up with different international agreements, such as the Paris Agreement. If you know about it, if you're interested, you can read about it. It's about climate change mainly, countries coming together and voluntarily deciding that we will reduce CO2 emissions. So that's something happening at the global level. A village making that commitment will not help. You need global governance there. Now, why does polycentric governance work? No single level governance can actually solve every environmental problem, because local communities have, of course, detailed knowledge of their resources, but they cannot resolve or solve global issues like climate change, right? Similarly, international organizations can help coordinate global action, but they cannot manage every village, forest, or irrigation system. So at international level, you may make a lot of commitment, but what if those commitments are not followed at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level? So when local communities, state governments, national governments, and the international organization, all of them work together, resource management becomes much more effective. This idea also supports Ostrom's 8th design principle, which says that large environmental problems should be managed through cooperation at different levels. So the main lesson is that environmental problems occurs at different scales, so governance should also happen at different scales. By combining local knowledge with national and international cooperation, we can actually manage natural resources much more effectively and sustainability. So you need institutions to be strong at every level. Now let us end by summarizing the main idea from today's lecture. The first is tragedy of commons mainly applies to open access resources where there are no rules and anyone can use resource. It does not necessarily apply to common property where communities have clear rules for managing shared resources. Second, Eleanor Ostrom showed that communities can successfully manage common resources. Her 8 design principles provide useful guidance for building effective and sustainable resource management systems. Third, there is no single property right systems, as we discussed. You can't really pinpoint one and say this is the best. A resource can be managed by individuals, communities, or government. What matters most is having clear rules, good institutions, and effective enforcement. Fourth, many environmental problems require, as we discussed, polycentric governance, where local communities, governments, and international organizations need to work together. Different levels of governance are needed because environmental problems occur at different scales. Finally, local knowledge, community participation, informal social norms are important strengths. They help people cooperate and manage resource actually more effectively. So one of the things to remember is that sustainable resource management depends not only on who owns the resource, but also on having good institutions, corporations, and well-designed rules, both formal and informal rules. And understanding these ideas helps us design better environmental policies and manage shared resources more successfully, sustainably, sorry. Now, if you look at these readings, you see Ostrom's reading, Governing the Commons, which was published in 1990. It's a classic reading. Similarly, if you want to understand why Ostrom was a critic to Hardin, you need to also read The Tragedy of the Commons. Then you also have this article on institutions, institutional change, and economic performance. And you have Struggle to Govern the Commons. So these are all very interesting articles. Again, something that you might like to go through because these are important for you to also understand this lecture. And then you identify a common governance success story in India and a region where you come from and see what made it work, something which is within a village and used by villagers, and think about it and see through what we studied today that what actually made that common still survive, whether it could be a river, it could be a village pond, it could be an irrigation system, it could be a grazing land, etc. But just think, what is that made that particular common work? All right, so I'm going to stop here for today and thank you.